My name is Tom, and what I'm about to tell you sounds unbelievable. I've been a forest ranger for 15 years, and before that I spent 8 years in the Navy. I've seen combat, I've dealt with dangerous wildlife, I've pulled people out of situations that left most folks sleepless for weeks. I was not prepared mentally or otherwise for what happened last October in the thick woods north of Montana. I'm not the kind of man who believes in monsters or tall tales. My job is based on facts, evidence, and keeping people safe in the outdoors. When hikers come to me about strange noises or odd tracks, I usually chalk it up to bears, elk, or an overactive imagination. Everything changed on October 12th when I came across something that, by all scientific accounts, shouldn't exist. The story actually began 3 weeks earlier. I was on a routine patrol, checking trails, fixing damaged signs, and clearing fallen branches. The area I cover is roughly 40 square miles of dense timber, steep ridges, and hidden valleys most visitors never see. The terrain is rough, but I know every trail, every creek, and every game path like the back of my hand. On September 20th, I found the first prints near Blackwater Creek, about 12 meters, roughly 39 feet, from the nearest campsite. At first glance, they looked like bear prints, but something was off. They were too long, too narrow, and they showed what appeared to be 5 distinct toe imprints. A bear's front paw is broad, and its claws extend well beyond the toes. These prints were different. I measured them with my ranger tape, 45 centimeters long, about 17.7 inches, 18 centimeters wide at the heel, about 7.1 inches, with a clearly defined heel pad. The stride between steps was enormous, nearly 1.8 meters, about 5.9 feet. I've tracked black bears and grizzlies for years, and I've never seen anything like it. The depth of the impressions suggested something extremely heavy, probably over 800 pounds, around 360 kilograms. What gave me chills was the pattern. These prints weren't wandering like an animal following scent or searching for food. They moved with purpose, following a route that maximized concealment while still allowing rapid travel through the terrain. That's not animal behavior. That's tactical thinking. I photographed and logged everything, thinking maybe it was a deformed bear or some weird anomaly. I reported it to my supervisor, but he brushed it off. "Wild animals do strange things sometimes," he said. "Maybe a bear with a foot injury is walking funny." That night, I went home and dug into every resource I could find on unusual footprints. I compared my photos to bear prints, human footprints, even gorilla prints. Nothing matched. The proportions were all wrong. Too long for a bear, too wide to be human, and the toe arrangement didn't match anything in the scientific literature. Over the next week, I found more tracks. They traced hunting routes through some of the thickest parts of the forest, areas even experienced hikers rarely venture into. Whatever it was knew the terrain better than most animals. It avoided open areas and hugged dense cover, almost as if it was deliberately concealing itself. What worried me most was where the tracks showed up. They clustered around water sources, game trails, and campsites. Hikers commonly use like someone was watching and learning human movement and patterns. I found prints near 3 different remote campsites that had been visited by people in the previous weeks. The tracks always approached from downwind, hidden in heavy vegetation, and never came closer than 200 yards, about 183 meters, to occupied sites. That kind of calculated surveillance indicates intelligence far beyond any known animal. By the end of September, I began to notice changes in the local wildlife. On morning patrols, I usually saw deer grazing, squirrels gathering nuts, and birds going about their routines. Suddenly, things were different. The deer were the skittiest I've ever seen. They bolted from the smallest noises, even sounds they'd normally ignore, like an ATV engine or a radio. I found a few deer carcasses that looked like they'd died of sheer panic. No wounds, no sign of predation, just animals that ran until they literally collapsed. Even worse were the carcasses and the shapes I started finding. They did not scatter randomly. They formed crude, straight lines heading away from specific spots in the woods, as if whatever they were fleeing from ran and died while trying to escape. Those same escape routes always matched the places where I'd found the unusual prints. The birds were acting strange too. Crows and ravens, normally bold and curious, were roosting high in the canopy and avoiding the ground altogether. I noticed large flocks gathering and making agitated calls whenever I approached certain areas. It was like they were warning each other. But the smaller animals gave the clearest sign that something was seriously wrong. Squirrels, chipmunks, and other rodents had essentially vanished from wide stretches of forest where they're normally everywhere. You can't walk 50 feet in healthy woods without seeing or hearing them. But in the areas with the tracks, there was nothing. It felt like they had simply disappeared. The silence was even more unsettling. Normally, the forest is alive with sound, the buzz of insects, the rustle of small animals through leaves, birdsong. But in some places, especially along the ridgelines where I found tracks, everything was unnaturally quiet. It felt eerie, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. On October 2nd, I saw a black bear behave in a way I'd never seen before. It was a large boar, maybe 400 pounds, around 180 kilograms. When it spotted me, it immediately climbed the nearest tree and wouldn't come down. Bears don't usually run from people unless they're surprised or protecting cubs. This bear was terrified, constantly looking back toward the deep woods like something was chasing it. I tried to get closer to see if it was injured or sick. As I approached, it began to make a real distress call, not the agitated huff a bear makes when startled, but a panicked scream. The bear was shaking with fear, clinging to a limb about 20 feet, roughly 6 meters, above the ground. That's when I noticed fresh claw marks on the trunk below where the bear was perched. Deep gouges in the wood, placed high enough they couldn't have been made by any ordinary predator. The scratch patterns showed something had tried to climb up after the bear. The marks were new, probably created within the last day or two. I backed off and left the bear alone, but the image of a 400-pound apex predator curled up on a branch in terror stayed with me for days. Whatever could terrify a top predator like that was something I did not want to run into. The calls started on October 5th. I was camping overnight at a remote monitoring station about 65 feet, roughly 20 meters, from headquarters, checking water sensors and maintaining equipment. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a sound I'd never heard before. At first, it was a low rumble, almost like a diesel engine idling off in the distance. But it didn't have the rise and fall of an engine, and it didn't echo through the valleys like mechanical noise tends to do. The rumble swelled into something between a roar and a howl, deeper than any wolf, longer than any bear, and more powerful than anything I could identify. The sound lasted about 30 seconds, and then stopped suddenly. What followed was absolute silence. No insects, no night birds, nothing. It was as if every living thing in the forest had frozen. What chilled me most was what happened next. About 10 minutes after that first call, I heard a reply. From a different direction, maybe 2 miles, about 3.2 kilometers away, a similar sound answered with subtle changes in pitch and rhythm. It was clearly a response communication between 2 or more creatures out there. Then a third voice replied from another direction, then a fourth. Within minutes, the calls layered into what sounded like a conversation, deep, resonant voices echoing across the mountains. The sounds had structure and pattern as if they were exchanging information. I grabbed my flashlight and my .45 and checked around the camp. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Worst of all was realizing the calls were coming from positions that gave them line of sight to my camp from multiple angles. They had me surrounded. I stayed awake all night, listening for anything that repeated. Nothing ever came right to the camp, but I could feel something out there in the dark. Every few minutes I'd hear a twig snap or a rustle of leaves, careful, large movements in the forest. The next morning I found more tracks around the campsite. They had been circling the area within roughly a 100-yard radius, like something had been watching me while I slept. The prints were fresh, definitely made during the night I was there. What terrified me was the range of sizes. At least 4 different individuals had been watching me. From prints about 16 inches is approximately equal to 40 centimeters. Long to 1 over 20 inches is approximately equal to 50 centimeters. Over the next week, I heard that call 3 more times. Always at night, always from different directions, but always that deep, powerful sound that seemed to vibrate the ground. I tried to record it on my phone, but the audio quality was too poor to capture the real depth and resonance. The pattern of the calls suggested these creatures were moving along established routes through the woods, patrol lines, or territorial boundaries, maybe. I started mapping where I'd heard the calls and found they formed a crude ring around an area roughly 10 square miles in size. That same area had the most tracks and the greatest disruption to wildlife. Other rangers began reporting odd sounds, too. The trail maintenance crew refused to work in certain sectors, saying they felt watched. 2 veteran backcountry guides canceled trips because their clients were too frightened by unexplained noises to continue. What really unnerved me was my supervisor's response when I told him about the calls. He was too calm, too prepared. He told me to file a report on the unusual wildlife activity, but warned me not to mention the calls to other staff or visitors. When I asked why, he said unverified reports of strange animal behavior could cause unnecessary panic among park visitors. That's when I realized this wasn't the first time anyone had reported those sounds. October 12th started like any other day. I'd been assigned to check on a research crew studying old-growth trees in one of the most remote parts of my patrol area. They'd been out of radio contact for 2 days, which, given the terrain, wasn't unusual, but procedure required a safety check. I loaded my ATV with water, emergency medical gear, and survival supplies, then took the old logging road that gets closest to their site. The road hadn't been maintained in decades, so the last 5 miles required hiking through some of the thickest forest in the region. The walk began normally. The weather was perfect clear sky, about 59 degrees Fahrenheit, is approximately equal to 15 degrees Celsius, and a light breeze that kept the bugs down. I stayed on the trail and covered the first 3 miles, about 4.8 kilometers, in under an hour. But as I pushed deeper, that familiar, worrying silence returned. By noon, I reached the area where the researchers should have been working. I found their base camp easily. 3 tents, a cooking area, and neatly arranged scientific gear sat in a small clearing, but the team was nowhere to be seen. The camp looked abandoned in a hurry. Personal items were scattered, food left outside attracting flies, and their expensive instruments lay exposed. Most unsettling was one tent partially collapsed, many poles broken. I called the researchers on the radio with no response. I fired 3 warning shots into the air, a standard distress signal, and waited. Nothing. That's when I found the tracks. They were everywhere around the camp, more than at any site I'd seen before. Same 18-inch prints, but now dozens of impressions crisscrossed the area, as if something had paced back and forth for hours. Some prints were so deep they had pressed through the forest floor down to the clay beneath. Following the tracks out of camp, I noticed they led to a steep, rocky gully about 200 yards, is approximately equal to 183 meters, to the north. The tracks ran in a series of dragged gouges across the ground, like something heavy had been hauled along the earth. A chill ran through me as the implications hit. I radioed headquarters to report the situation and request backup, but all I got was static. The dense timber and steep terrain make communications sketchy even in good conditions, and I was too far from any relay tower to get a clear signal. Protocol would have me mark my position and fall back to call for help, but if the research team was injured and needed immediate aid, every minute counted. I decided to follow the trail a short distance to see if I could find them. The path dropped into a narrow gully clogged with fallen trees and thick underbrush. The tracks were harder to follow on the rocky ground, but I could still see disturbed vegetation and, here and there, clear prints in the softer patches. Whatever had moved through wasn't wandering aimlessly, it was traveling with intent. Halfway down the gully, I found torn fabric snagged on branches, the same material and color as the jackets the researchers wore. A few yards farther, I came across a damaged GPS unit and a ripped backpack marked with deep claw gouges. On the surface, it could have looked like a bear attack, but the prints didn't match any bear I've tracked, and bears don't usually drag prey. They feed where they kill or cache food nearby. This looked like something had intentionally dragged the researchers away from their camp. The sense of being watched only intensified the deeper I went. I stopped many times to scan the surrounding woods, seeing nothing out of the ordinary, but everything in me shaped by 8 years in the military was screaming that I was in danger. About a mile from the camp, I heard something ahead. At first, it sounded like a large animal crashing through brush, but the rhythm was wrong too, even too forceful. It sounded like footsteps. I drew my pistol and moved cautiously, using trees for cover. The sound came from a small clearing roughly 150 feet ahead, just beyond a dense stand of pines. I could hear labored breathing and now and then a low moan. I crept to the edge of the clearing, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. A huge, shaggy Douglas dog stood near the edge, but in the center of the clearing was the largest living thing I've ever encountered. It was enormous, about 17 feet tall, and built like a linebacker. Its body was covered in thick, coarse, dark brown fur, like a bear's winter coat. It stood upright on two legs, but the proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung nearly to its knees. Its shoulders were unbelievably broad, and its head was enormous. It was holding something in its hands. I watched it flip the object over and examine it closely. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was one of the research team's GPS units. The creature manipulated the device with a startling delicacy, almost as if it was trying to figure out how it worked. I stood frozen for several minutes, silently watching. This creature moved with intelligence and purpose, not like a mindless animal. It checked the GPS, set it down, picked other items from a pile I hadn't noticed, then returned to the unit. It was clearly capable of complex thought and problem solving. Then the wind shifted, and I knew I'd made a mistake. The creature's head snapped up and turned toward me. Even at roughly 50 yards, I could see its eyes. Intelligent, alert, and locked on to my position. It had smelled me. For a few seconds, we simply stared at one another. The creature's face was a cross between human and ape, but somehow more primitive than either. Its brow was heavy and pronounced, the jaw massive, and the nose broad and flattened. But those eyes radiated an unmistakable intelligence. Then it straightened up and roared. Up close, that sound was even more terrifying than it had been from a distance. It was a challenge, a warning, and a raw display of strength all at once. The roar echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to make the ground beneath my feet tremble. I did the only thing my military training had taught me to do when confronted by a direct threat. I raised my pistol and fired. The first shot hit the creature square in the torso, just below the right shoulder. At that range, with a .45 revolver, that round should have felled anything moving on the planet. Instead, the animal staggered back a step, looked down at the wound, then glared at me with irritation. It started coming toward me. I fired again, this time aiming for the head. The shot went high and left my hand must have been shaking. The creature broke into a run, covering the roughly 45 meters, about 150 feet, between us, faster than you'd expect something that size to move. I fired 3 more rounds as it charged. I'm sure at least one hit its chest. None of the shots slowed it. When it was about 20 feet, roughly 6 meters away, I rolled to the side and dove behind a fallen log. It sprinted past me, then turned and looked around, trying to locate where I'd gone. I could hear it panting, and I smelled it. There was the musky animal odor, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. From my cover, I could see the wounds the bullets had made. There was blood, but not as much as you'd expect. The creature was wounded, but not incapacitated. I hid behind that log for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The creature paced back and forth, occasionally making low growls and sniffing the air. It knew I was nearby, but it couldn't pinpoint my position. Eventually, it seemed to lose interest. It returned to the center of the clearing, gathered up the items it had been inspecting, and vanished into the trees, moving north. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared move. Once I was sure it was gone, I checked the clearing. The evidence of what had happened was unmistakable. The creature's prints were everywhere, deep impressions pressed into the soft soil. I measured and photographed the clearest impressions. They matched the prints I'd been finding for weeks, only far more detailed. I could see individual toe marks, the texture of the pads, even what looked like impressions of hair along the edges. I found places where my rounds had struck trees after passing through or over the creature. One bullet had hit a pine about 6 feet, is approximately equal to 1.8 meters, off the ground, roughly chest height for the animal. The round had whizzed into the tree, which indicated it had struck something solid before embedding. Most important, I found blood. Dark red drops led out of the clearing in the direction the creature had gone. I bagged samples and secured an evidence kit, even though I wasn't sure what would become of them. I also found more of the research team's gear scattered around the clearing. GPS units, sample boxes, and clothing had been piled and rifled through as if the creature had been searching. but there was no sign of the researchers themselves. I knew I had to get out of the woods immediately. The animal was wounded and probably angry, and I didn't know whether there were others nearby. My radio still wouldn't work, and I was miles from the nearest rescue. I started walking back to my ATV as fast as I could. Every shadow looked like a potential threat. Every sound made me jump. I kept my pistol in my hand and tried to stay in open areas with good sight lines, avoiding the dense underbrush where something could be hiding. Halfway back to the ranger camp, I heard the call again. The same deep, resonant sound I'd been hearing for weeks, but this time it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It sounded like the creatures were communicating, perhaps coordinating a response to my presence. What froze my blood was that other noises began to weave into the calls, sounds that resembled human voices but warped and wrong. At first I thought they might be the missing researchers calling out, but the voices weren't right. They were too deep, too echoing, as if something was trying to mimic human speech without understanding how it worked. I picked up the pace, almost running where the terrain allowed. Military conditioning kept me going. Even though I'm more than 15 years older than when I left the Navy, I still had the fitness to keep a fast pace for several miles. When I reached the hunter camp, I grabbed water and a flashlight from the supply pile and pushed on toward my ATV. I didn't stop to comb the camp for more clues about what happened to the researchers. My only priority was to get back to civilization alive. The walk back to the ATV took a brutal 2 hours. I heard noises in the woods a number of times but saw nothing. I couldn't tell whether something was tailing me or my nerves were finally catching up with me. About a mile from my ATV, I had to stop and rest. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and my hands shook so badly I could barely hold my weapon. That's when the voices started enough to make me feel like I might collapse. The calls came from somewhere back in the timber, but they were wrong. The words sounded human, but the cadence and pitch were distorted, like something imitating sounds it had heard without understanding them. Those calls seemed designed to draw me back into the forest. I forced myself toward the ATV even though the strange calls followed me for nearly a mile, always staying hidden in the thick brush. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch. Other times they came from much farther away. They never stopped. They never gave up trying to lure me back into the trees. When I finally reached my ATV, I'd never been so happy to see a machine in my life. I started it and turned back down the old logging road as fast as I could, not stopping until I hit the main highway. Even then, I felt uneasy, constantly checking the rear view, waiting for something to come tearing after me down the mountain road. The strange calls stopped when I reached the ATV, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I reported everything as soon as I got back to headquarters. My supervisor listened with increasing skepticism, especially when I described shooting at a 17-foot creature and it apparently shrugging off multiple .45 rounds. The next morning, a search and rescue team was dispatched to look for the missing researchers. I led them back to the clearing where I'd encountered the creature. Team S found all the things I described: the abandoned camp, scattered equipment, and the huge tracks, but their interpretation differed from mine. The team leader, a veteran ranger with 25 years on the job, concluded the researchers had been attacked by a large bear. The scattered equipment and the hurriedly abandoned camp fit a theory of people fleeing after a bear encounter. He suggested the gear had been moved by a bear dragging bodies, and he tried to account for the tracks. They measured the prints 45 centimeters long and 18 centimeters wide with a clear heel, but proposed they might be the result of a bear walking bipedally or several bear prints overlapping and distorted by rain and time. They found the blood samples I'd collected, but when those samples were sent to the state lab, the results were inconclusive. The DNA was degraded and contaminated, making identification impossible. Most maddening of all, the bullet marks I remembered in the trees had somehow vanished. When the investigative team went into the clearing, they found no sign of gunshots on the trees. I'd seen no holes, no damage, nothing. It was as if the encounter never happened. The official report concluded the research team had been killed by a large bear, possibly a wandering grizzly from Canada. Their bodies were never found, a sadly plausible outcome in thick, remote forest where scavengers can obliterate traces quickly. I was cleared of wrongdoing, but my story of the encounter was dismissed as an hallucination brought on by stress and psychological trauma from discovering an attacked campsite. My supervisor suggested I see a counselor and take some time off to recover from the incident. In the weeks that followed, I began to suspect the official response went deeper than I'd first thought. My incident report was classified in a way that seemed excessive for a simple bear attack. When I asked to review the file, I was told the case had been taken over by federal wildlife agencies and that local staff no longer had access. The search for the missing researchers was called off after only 5 days, which felt rushed compared with the resources usually devoted to missing person cases. When the families of the researchers tried to organize their own searches, park officials blocked them, citing safety concerns and severe weather. Most telling was how other park staff reacted after hearing about my encounter. Several rangers privately came to me to share their own experiences with strange calls, odd tracks, and wildlife behavior that didn't match known patterns, but none of them were willing to put their stories on the record. A veteran ranger told me similar incidents had occurred for decades, but they were always explained away as bear attacks, hoaxes, or misidentifications. He said there was an unspoken policy to bury reports that could harm the park's reputation or hurt tourism revenue. I started digging into the historical records for comparable encounters in the area. What I found was disturbing. Going back more than 50 years, there were dozens of reports of hikers who vanished, unexplained sounds, and sightings of large upright creatures in the forests of northern Montana. In every case, the official explanation tied the incident to known wildlife or human error, but the pattern was so consistent, it couldn't be ignored. The incident sites form a rough territory covering hundreds of square miles of remote, rugged forest. The timing of encounters follows seasonal patterns, suggesting migration or territorial behavior, and descriptions of the creature's appearances are remarkably consistent across independent reports over many decades. I returned to duty after 2 weeks of administrative leave, but my ability to function as a ranger was badly affected. I had trouble patrolling alone in remote areas, especially at night. Every noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched whenever I stepped into the deep woods. My relationships with other staff became strained. Some coworkers were sympathetic and believed me, but others clearly thought I'd broken down. My supervisor reassigned me to duties closer to headquarters and away from the remote zones where the incidents had occurred. Worst of all was the knowledge that the research team had likely died because I hadn't acted sooner. If I'd taken the initial signs more seriously, insisted on backup before investigating the abandoned camp, or prepared better for what I might find, maybe they would still be alive. I've struggled with survivor's guilt and PTSD since that encounter. The nightmares began about a month after the incident and haven't stopped. I dream about that clearing, the creature rifling through the research gear, the intelligence I saw in its eyes when it looked at me. The scariest dreams are the ones I can't wake from, where the creature catches me and I wake up screaming. 6 months after the encounter, I was contacted by a researcher at a university in Oregon. He'd heard about the case through informal channels and wanted to interview me for a study he was conducting on unexplained wildlife encounters in remote regions. The researcher, who asked to remain anonymous, told me my experience fit into a much larger pattern across the Pacific Northwest and the northern Rocky Mountains. He'd documented more than 200 cases over the past 20 years, including credible witnesses, law enforcement, military personnel, scientists, and experienced outdoorsmen. According to his work, the animals I encountered are part of an unknown primate population, persisting in some of North America's most remote wildlands. Their intelligence and elusive nature have kept them out of mainstream science, but increasing human incursions into their territory have produced more frequent encounters. The researcher shared photos and plaster casts of footprints from other sites that were nearly identical to the ones I found. He also played recordings of vocalizations that matched the sounds I'd heard in the weeks before my encounter. The evidence was convincing, but he warned me that going public could ruin his academic career. He told me there are government agencies that know about these creatures, but they've agreed to keep it quiet to avoid public panic and to protect the animals from exploitation. Witnesses who tell their stories publicly often face ridicule, career damage, and sometimes worse consequences. I've stayed silent about my encounter for over a year, but the weight of that secret has become unbearable. I know what I saw in that clearing, and I know the thing I shot was not a bear or any known animal. It was something science says shouldn't exist. I have the scars, physical and mental, to prove it happened. These creatures are real, they're intelligent, They are dangerous when threatened, and they live in remote wildlands most people never see. They've learned to avoid contact with humans, but as we keep encroaching on their territory, encounters are becoming more frequent. I don't know how many there are, or exactly what they are, but I do know they are not mindless animals. How that creature handled the research gear, how it coordinated with others of its kind, and the intelligence I saw in its eyes when it looked at me, these things convinced me they are thinking beings with culture and social structure. The missing research team was never found, and I suspect they never will be. Whatever happened to them in that forest has been covered up by people who decided the truth was too dangerous for the public to know. I resigned from the National Park Service. I couldn't keep working in an environment where I had to act like nothing had happened. The nightmares kept getting worse, and I couldn't risk being responsible for other people's safety when I knew about threats in the woods we weren't allowed to acknowledge. I'm sharing my account because people deserve to know what's out there. If you're planning to hike or camp in remote wildlands, especially in the Pacific Northwest or the Northern Rockies, keep in mind you may not be alone. These animals seem to avoid contact when possible, but they will defend themselves if threatened. They're extremely strong, frighteningly intelligent, and appear able to coordinate with one another. Standard precautions for known wildlife, making noise, storing food properly, carrying bear spray may not be enough. If you find odd tracks, hear strange calls, or notice other signs that don't fit known wildlife, exercise extreme caution. If animals in the area act unusually fearful or aggressive, consider leaving immediately. And if you see one of these creatures, don't do what I did. Don't try to confront it or prove it exists. Get away as quietly and quickly as you can. I lost my career, my peace of mind, and my trust in institutions I once believed in. But I also gained something, the knowledge that there are still mysteries in this world, unnamed creatures hiding in the dark beyond our civilization. Whether that knowledge was worth the price I paid, I can't say. But I know what I encountered in that Montana forest was real. I also know others will encounter them. I hope they'll be better prepared than I was. I hope they'll have better luck getting others to believe them. The truth is out there, literally. And one day, whether the government likes it or not, the world will have to face the fact that we are not alone on this planet. For more accounts like this, see here